Welcome aboard to NJ.com's football chat here on a Friday, a Rutgers chat as we get set for a Big Ten battle out in East Lansing, Michigan tomorrow afternoon. We have Rutgers traveling to Michigan State, now bowl-eligible Rutgers traveling out there with us. We have Dan Duggan, of course, with us, NJ Advanced Media. Mike Griffith is from MLive.com. He covers Michigan State athletics. Guys, thanks for giving us a few minutes here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you guys. Let's start with you, Mike. Michigan State here, obviously one of the best teams in the country, a top 11 team, and one that I'm sure is ready for this game coming up tomorrow against Rutgers on Senior Day.
Yeah, you know, the focus has been a lot on Senior Day. It's been a lot on Michigan State. Obviously, the Spartans need to impress the College Football Playoff Committee. Their rankings are a little different than, you know, the USA Today Coaches Poll has Michigan State number 9. The AP poll has them number 10. Number 11 in that College Football Playoff Committee rankings. Really need to beat Rutgers impressively. Obviously, the committee does look at scoring margin. I had an opportunity to talk to Jeff Long earlier this year and ask him what they cap the margin of victory at. You know, in the old BCS, they used to cap the margin of victory at 28 points in all the computers. They don't cap it. So Mark D'Antonio is not one to run up the score, but Michigan State does need to win impressively if they want to secure one of those New Year's Day 6 bowls.
It's not going to be a New Year's Day bowl, Dan, but it's going to be a bowl for Rutgers, who they have to feel so much better about themselves after the win last week against Indiana, snapping the losing streak, and now all the questions about Kyle Flood and the future of the program, they go away for a little while. It's just back to a game here against Michigan State.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the worst-case scenario was going to be going into that Maryland game, needing that one to get bowl eligible. I mean, obviously, you know, if they could ever beat Michigan State, that would be, you know, just cap the season, be the great, you know, one of the greatest upsets I've ever had. But you know, even that, you know, they have a lot of wiggle room now. That Maryland game becomes what bowl you're going to get into. It can kind of change the perception of the season, but it's not, everything's not hanging on it. I think it was huge just kind of get that monkey off the back, beat Indiana, get bowl eligible, and like I said, now they're kind of playing with house money, obviously, this weekend. And really, I think, you know, get through this weekend intact, and you know, Maryland's really the big game. Obviously, you know, they got to go through East Lansing first, though.
Mike, how about Michigan State for Rutgers fans watching that haven't seen a lot of Michigan State? I mean, they are on national TV. They had that game against Oregon earlier in the year, where a lot of us watched them then. But if you haven't watched Michigan State much and you're a Rutgers fan, what kind of team, what kind of players are they going to expect and they're going to get to see tomorrow?
Well, you know, of late, Michigan State's really started to run the football more. Earlier in the year, they were riding the arm of Connor Cook. We saw that against Oregon. We saw it against Ohio State. You know, in cooler, inclement weather, we've seen Michigan State run the ball more. At Maryland, they ran the ball a lot. If they can run the ball successfully on Rutgers, I would expect them to keep it on the ground as much as possible and pound it. I-formation team, a lot of power football. You may see some packages with some more mobile quarterbacks. That's been talked about. We haven't seen those packages in a while, but they do have some other quarterbacks that are pretty mobile. Connor Cook, of course, can take it down the field. They've got some good receivers. A lot of it will have to do with how Rutgers plays them. Michigan State pretty much devises the game plan based on their opponent. I know, talking with Dan, that Rutgers has had some trouble against the run. You can look at them and see that it's a smaller front seven. Again, it is Senior Day. So I would expect to see a lot of Jeremy Langford and Nick Hill. Those are two senior tailbacks, and they'll pound it. Defensively, very aggressive defense. Could play into the hands of Rutgers. Rutgers does like to get the ball downfield. If the Scarlet Knights can get any kind of a run game going, their play action could be effective. But if they can't run the football, it might be a pretty long day for their offense.
Dan, how about the other side? MLive viewers watching this probably haven't watched much Rutgers, maybe a little on the Big Ten Network, especially that Saturday night against Penn State. But in general, what kind of Rutgers team are they going to see tomorrow in East Lansing?
Yeah, well, some of the things Mike just outlined a little scary when you're talking about a matchup-wise, because like he said, if they're going to try and pound the ball, you know, Rutgers certainly hasn't shown that they're capable of stopping that. In the last 4 games, they've given up over 1,200 yards rushing, which that's almost as many as they gave up last year in 13 games. So it's been quite a turnaround there in the wrong direction. So, yeah, defensively, there's just still big question marks there. On the other side of the ball, like Mike said too, it's going to have to be big plays. I really don't see Rutgers being able to methodically drive the ball consistently against this defense. I'm really interested to see how the freshman running backs do, because obviously Josh Hicks and Robert Martin were a revelation last week. But you have to keep in perspective that is Indiana's defense. This is Michigan State's defense. It's a slightly higher plane. But if they can just kind of be somewhat effective, and I don't think anyone's expecting them to duplicate last week's effort. Like you said, just keep the defense honest, and then it's really going to be up to Leonte Carew and guys like that to make plays on the outside. And that's really, when you look at what Michigan State's one kind of bugaboo has been on defense, of giving up some big plays in the passing game, and that's the one strength Rutgers has had. Gary Nova leads the country in yards per attempt. So if they can kind of just hang around and connect on a couple of big plays to Leonte Carew, maybe it's an interesting game. Other than that, I just don't see Rutgers being able to consistently move the ball against this defense.
What about the Big Ten in general? We've done a couple of these chats this year with Dan and one of our other Rutgers beat reporters, Mike, and we really haven't got a chance to look at the Big Ten as a whole because it was earlier in the season. I mean, the season is almost over now. We're getting close to bowl season. This conference as a whole, Mike, you've seen a lot of it over the years. You've seen it this year now. Rutgers, you saw Maryland last week, the new kind of Big Ten. How do you expect this conference to fare when we get into bowl season? Do you think this will be a strong showing from the 2014 Big Ten teams?
Yeah, I think so. You got to remember the last couple of years we haven't had Penn State or Ohio State in the bowl rotation, and therefore we've seen some teams maybe knocked up. The third-place team really wasn't the third-place team. It was the fourth-place team. I think with Ohio State and Penn State back in the picture, though, particularly Ohio State, I think you'll see a better showing. I think we've already seen some things. Rutgers, right off the bat, went out west and was able to beat Washington State. I think that bode well for the Big Ten. Wisconsin should have beaten LSU in Houston. They called that a neutral site game, but Houston's very close to LSU. That was really a regional home game for LSU. Michigan State, although they lost to Oregon, they were up by 2 scores over the Ducks late in the third quarter at Autzen Stadium. Really probably should have won that game had they played better, executed better in the fourth quarter. I think the Big Ten can play with anybody in the country. I think I told you guys I covered the SEC for 20 years. And when the SEC is great, I know when it's great. We've seen it. They've won national titles. But what you're seeing in the SEC this year is not great football. You're seeing sloppy football. You're seeing a lot of young quarterbacks. And yet, a lot of people are drinking the Kool-Aid because the SEC is beating the SEC, and therefore it must be great until you look a little bit deeper and see that Indiana, a team that has not won a Big Ten game, a team that Rutgers handled easily, beat Missouri at Missouri. That game's not going to go away. That's not a fluke when you go into another stadium and win. Somehow SEC folks apologize for that, and Big Ten critics ignore that. But sitting here in my seat and seeing what I've seen in college football this year, I think the Big Ten is as good as any conference in the country, and I think there's a lot of parity in college football. I think the Pac-12 is very good. I think the Big 12 can be very good. I saw Michigan State go into Maryland and win easily, quite frankly, 37-15. That's a team that TCU beat by 3 points, and yet everybody thought that, that was the team that West Virginia beat by 3 points. And yet everyone thought when TCU beat West Virginia in a close game, that was just the greatest thing on earth. So the transitive properties are what they are. The eye test does not lie. You can look and see where the best running backs in the country are at. They're in the Big Ten. And, certainly I think Michigan State's defense is pretty good. And right now I'd put J.T. Barrett up against anybody in Ohio State. If they're not one of the top 4 teams in the country in the playoff, that'd be a travesty.
Dan, agree. I know you do the power rankings on NJ.com with the Big Ten every week. I mean, is this conference a little bit underrated here as we get close to the postseason? Seems like Mike certainly thinks they're going to do pretty well.
Yeah, it's tough to follow that up. He covered all the bases there. I think I guess we won't really know until around New Year's Day. But like as he cited a bunch of the examples there where the Big Ten has definitely fared a little better than probably the national perception. And I think definitely when you look at the running back situation, it's you have 4 of the top, arguably 8 or 10 running backs in the country in one conference. I think it's tough to look at teams play within their conference and then extrapolate how that'll go when you play different styles and everything. So I think that's going to be really interesting. I think Mike made some good points about having Ohio State in there and just how that'll affect the matchups. Like you said, if it's the third place Big Ten team playing against the second place Big 12 team, whatever it might be, it's not as accurate as a matchup. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But it always comes down to matchups when you get to bowl season. And I think it's going to be interesting to see some of these kind of smash mouth Big Ten teams, how they do against some of these other conferences.
We're talking Michigan State Rutgers. Mike Griffith of MLive.com, Dan Duggan with us, NJ Advanced Media, as we get set for this game coming up on Saturday with Rutgers traveling out to East Lansing. Mike, if this is a game in the fourth quarter, and I don't know if any of the 3 of us believe it will be, but if it is, What happened? Did Michigan State not show up? Did Rutgers have a great game plan, maybe hit some plays down the field, special teams? What has to happen, I guess, for Michigan State to not be comfortably ahead, in the fourth quarter tomorrow?
Well, you mentioned special teams, and that's something that we really haven't talked about. And, Dan kind of tipped me off to that earlier this week about, just how proficient Rutgers has been blocking kicks this year. And Michigan State has had some struggles in their field goal game, and really against Maryland was the first time that they had bogged down a little bit in the red zone, having to settle for 3 field goals in the first half of that game. That has not been Michigan State's MO. But if they continue to have some red zone issues and they try and kick a field goal, certainly Rutgers has proven that that can be a game changer type of aspect for the Scarlet Knights. Michigan State has not had many troubles with turnovers. They have one of the best turnover margins in the country. But you never know how weather's going to play a factor in that. You mentioned overlooking Rutgers. You would think at this stage of the season that you wouldn't overlook anyone if you're Michigan State. If Michigan State can win these next 2 regular season games in their bowl game, this senior class will tie for the winningest senior class in Michigan State history. They do have things to play for. You've got some guys moving up career lists. But if for whatever reason they decide that they don't have to show up for Rutgers, you can get in trouble in a hurry. I don't take that victory that Rutgers had at Washington State lightly at all. It's tough to go out west, number one, and number two, to play that style of football. I've seen Rutgers go west before and go into hostile environments and play good football. This is not the pushover program that it once was. It's got 6 victories. It just got done pounding Indiana. It knows what to expect. It had a tough 3-game stretch against Ohio State and Wisconsin and Nebraska. So I think the Scarlet Knights know what they're in for. Michigan State Senior Day, sometimes you wonder where these guys' heads are at. Last year they played Minnesota in a game that was probably closer than it should have been. I believe it was 14-0 or 14-3, but it wasn't a blowout by any stretch. If Rutgers shows up to play, they can stay in it. The big thing is they have to limit Michigan State from big plays. They need to try and pressure Connor Cook and force some turnovers, and I think they need to make some plays in special teams.
Same question for you, Dan. If this is a game in the fourth quarter, what did Rutgers do right? Or I guess at the same token, what did Michigan State do wrong?
I'd say Rutgers did just about everything right if it's a game. Like I said, the matchups, I just don't see a lot of advantages for them. So like you said, it has to be a lot of things going right as far as big plays on offense, like I mentioned earlier. Like Mike said, special teams. And the thing about the special teams, they haven't blocked a kick, I want to say, since that Michigan field goal. So it's been a little while. They're probably due to make a play. And even at that, they haven't had a return for a touchdown on either a kickoff return or a fumble return or a block kick return. Like they need a play like that can really turn things around in a hurry. So Jarian Grant kind of got on track against Indiana last week with a long kickoff return and good punt returns. They definitely need more of that again because field position I think is going to be crucial. Because again, I just really think they're going to have a tough time consistently moving the ball. So that, I think it really comes down to a lot of things are going to have to go their way. Like Mike said, the turnovers isn't something that Michigan State does very often, and they do take it away. So Rutgers needs to somehow flip that dynamic, which is obviously going to be a tall task. So my answer is pretty much everything needs to go right for that scenario to unfold.
Last one for you guys. Mike, we'll start with you. Tomorrow evening when Rutgers fans are talking about this game, they're reacting to it on our website, who's the player that we might not know about right now, but we're going to know about tomorrow? We know about the quarterback. We know about some of the stars from Michigan State, but who's the player that's going to make a play or two that his name will be commented on NJ.com quite a bit tomorrow night?
Boy, that's awful tough. If you look at Michigan State's team, guys, they have not had a Big Ten Player of the Week yet, which is pretty remarkable when you look at a team that's ranked number 11 in the country or 10 or 9, depending on which poll you look at. There's been a lot of good from Michigan State, but I haven't really seen anything dynamic. I mean, that's why it's remarkable that that they're sitting here at 8-2. Jeremy Langford's a pretty good running back, but he's probably only 5th or 6th best in the Big Ten. Tony Lippett is the Big Ten's leading receiver with 99.9 yards per game, but he's not a guy you've seen on SportsCenter a whole heck of a lot. And as celebrated and as good as that defense is, it's nowhere near as good as it was last year, and you haven't seen the same type of staple plays. I guess a name that I think is starting to come out of anonymity, I mean, you're all aware of Shalik Calhoun. He's a New Jersey guy, and I'm sure Shalik will get his sack and a half or maybe 2, business as usual. But the guy who's emerging from Michigan State is an outside linebacker by the name of Ed Davis, who's actually near the top of the charts in all the defensive categories. Ed's a guy who could be eventually good enough to play in the league one day. He's a first-year starter. He'll create a lot of headaches for Rutgers. I can guarantee you that Kyle Flood and his coaching staff know about him and who he is. They'll send him on a lot of blitzes, and I think Michigan State's going to try and get to know him, and I think you'll see a lot of Ed Davis in the backfield.
Dan, how about Rutgers? Who's the player that the student section at Michigan State tomorrow is going to be screaming about at some point?
Well, I'm guessing Michigan State fans probably aren't too familiar with too many Rutgers players, period, so I could go really obvious. But then again, if they've been reading Mike's copy all week, I'm sure they're up to speed now on the big names like Leonte Carew and whatnot. So I think the freshman running backs, I mean, even they might be getting a little bit of acclaim after their performance last week, but if they can ever follow that up, I'm sure that'll be the two names in Hicks and Martin that they'll walk away saying, oh boy, like these guys are a little better than we thought, because obviously there's not a lot of tape on them, not a lot of highlights on them that really had one game to really shine. I'm going to go a little further off the radar though, because NJ.com readers obviously know those guys well now. I'm going to say Andre Patton, the wide receiver who was looking like the number 2 guy out of camp, and he suffered just a complete freak injury where he landed on a ball in the last scrimmage and bruised his kidney and missed the first 4 games and really got set back because of that. So he's a guy who's shown that he can do it. He was in position to do it after training camp. And then when you add in the fact that Andrew Trezilli, who's been their kind of big play threat as a wide receiver, is questionable, and I would say it's probably closer to doubtful with a hamstring injury, someone's going to have to step up on the other side of Carew. So I think Andre Patton's a guy who hasn't had a breakout game yet this year, but I think maybe he's due, and he'd be a name if it can't just all be Leonte Carew. So I would say Patton is a guy if things are going to go well and the student section going to be cursing somebody out, they might be saying, who is this guy? It would be Andre Patton, I'll say.
Great stuff, guys. Appreciate a few minutes here, and I'll be watching tomorrow. And if Rutgers pulls off a special teams play early, I'll be watching even more closely down the stretch. Mike Griffith, Dan Duggan joining us here on NJ.com. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the game tomorrow, guys.
All right, thanks a lot.